It is more difficult to consume in an artistic way than it is to create in an artistic way. Now that sounds kind of absurd from like an intuitive perspective. We think of making like art as this very kind of difficult emotional task, and consuming art relatively easy, right? To read a book versus to write a book. But I think to consume artistically is very different than to just consume passively. So, looking at these two things, artistic creation and artistic consumption, I think there's something very interesting that's different between the two of them. And in the case of artistic creation, making art, it's very difficult, I think, to truly fail. If you set out to make art, to make something beautiful, and you sit down and you're like open with yourself and you express your feelings and emotions, I think you can create something that people would call art. And maybe it's not the most skilled, if you're painting or drawing, or maybe, it's not the most grammatical if you're writing a book or, I don't know, fan fiction or something. But I don't think it takes much for those things to be qualified as art and for them to be of a level where people can enjoy them, at least in some way. Now, on the flip side, consumption. With consumption, it's incredibly easy to not consume in a beautiful way. And I think that's really a product of the world that we live in, where people are constantly consuming, scrolling on TikTok or social media, constantly listening to music, constantly, doing anything. I mean, as humans, we are constantly consuming the world, perceiving, taking it in. Sort of every action we do is a consumption of the world around us. And as we do that, I think we get used to doing so passively, to consuming passively, to scrolling without thinking, to eating without tasting, these kinds of things. And it takes a very concerted effort in a world of constant consumption to actually slow down and really enjoy something. Because it takes this additional effort that is not necessary. We're almost like, to create art, it is necessary to have intention. It's necessary to have emotion. But to read a book, you don't need to necessarily involve yourself with it. You can just read the words, sort of take in the information. And I think the alternative to that, as a reader and as a consumer of art, an active approach is an approach that comes from a place of empathy. And that is to look at a work of art and kind of really open oneself up to it and try to understand and try to put oneself in the place of the artist and to try to experience the world through this work of art and, let it speak into kind of your soul, I guess, to be very artistic and poetic about it. And that's very, very hard to do, right? It's hard to empathize with people often, and I think it's even harder to sit with something kind of removed from a person and really look at that thing with an empathetic, intentional approach, particularly with the difficulty of being conditioned to consume passively. Now, with creation, we don't really need empathy. You don't need empathy to create art. You can confess your heart and soul and put selfhood onto the page. And that's enough, right? That's enough to make good art, even great art. It's enough to make popular art and successful art. You don't need to listen. You don't need to step outside of yourself, really. Which is not the case for an intimate understanding of art from the consumption side. So, and I think that's reflected in the world we live in. Right? People talk about like media literacy, and people talk about, literacy in general, and also this world that's lacking community and distance from each other and, isolated. And I think predominantly, right, we're living in a society, at least in the kind of consumer capital, late capitalism parts of the world. We're living in this very non-empathetic place that cares about fundamentally consumption, right? Dollars, amounts, numbers, transactions, and not a world that values or prioritizes human connection, empathy, being open, really respecting the expression of others. And careful consumption of art acts as a sort of antidote to those things, I think, at least in a personal level, right? Not saying that reading poetry and empathizing with poets will, change the world, but it can change oneself, and it can make you, the reader, a more empathetic person. And I saw a quote recently, just like from some poet on Instagram, and it said, the revolution requires close reading, or something. The revolution will require close reading. And I think there's a very true sentiment in a statement like that. That to have positive change, that's driven out of community and connection. And I think to be able to listen and to be able to read closely and to be able to do those things is an empathetic action. And if we can't empathize with a, book, how are we going to empathize with a person, with a world, with a society? And of course, just reading won't cause that, right? There are plenty of people who keep their books in their noses in their books of theory and never make a change. But at the same time, maybe one of those prerequisites of making a change in the world, of being better, of being more moral, is to read closely and to empathize, and maybe not just with art, but with all things, with all consumption, and to do so carefully. to not just consume and be passive and mindless and empty. That's a thought. A little ramble. Maybe idealistic. Maybe there's some truth there, though. And I know at least that reading closely, empathizing with art, has helped me a lot in being open to more people, more ideas, more experiences. And that might be a place for other people to start as well in becoming, better. It also helps you make art, which is cool because I make art. I think that's all. Keep making art, keep reading art,